Ancel Keys is a very colorful, charismatic individual. He is extremely aggressive. There are accounts of him where, even his friends and colleagues call him impossible to argue with anyone because he will argue anyone to the death. He had an enormous overconfidence in his own beliefs. He had the erroneous assumption that he was right until proven wrong, which, as you know, and I hope many of your listeners do, is the opposite of how science takes place, which is that you are really wrong until there's a body of evidence where you feel like you can be semi-right about something, and that it always can be disproven by the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. But Ancel Keys was also a very self-promotional sort of person, and he was able to get himself into the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, such that in 1961, the American Heart Association, which is the premier, still is, but at that time, even more so, the lone public health organization giving Americans advice on heart disease, desperate to provide some kind of guidance to Americans who are clamoring for guidance on how to prevent heart disease, again, the number one killer. They come out with a statement in 1961, the first anywhere in the world, saying, avoid saturated fat and dietary cholesterol is the best measure of prevention against heart disease. And replace those saturated fats with what we now call seed oils, then called vegetable oils. So that is really the little acorn of advice that grew into the giant oak tree that we now have really worldwide. But it all started with the American Heart Association in 1961. And I just have to tell a little story here, which is that Procter & Gamble, remember, maker of Crisco, also then later came out with Crisco oil. They really launched the American Heart Association in 1948 they made them the beneficiary of a fundraiser, a radio show, and the Walking Man contest. And they then collected all the money from that fundraiser and gave what is the equivalent, I think today now, like $20 million to the American Heart Association from this contest in 1948. And according to the company's own history, that really catapulted the American Heart Association into being able to open chapters all over the country and becoming sort of the beginning of the powerhouse that it now is today. So, and there are other stories about how the president of the American Heart Association was called out by his colleagues for posing with a bottle of Crisco oil in educational videos. So, and Procter & Gamble has, as the last time I checked, was still a donor to the American Heart Association. But it's only to say...
Hold on. This is such a mind-blowing fact. I remember when I first heard this, having to fact check it because it contravenes our understanding. When you hear American Heart Association and you see that logo, you think these are medical people who are telling me things based on the evidence that is accumulated in science and medicine. You don't understand that this has been launched by a for-profit corporation that has an interest in what you believe is good health advice. And, am I wrong that they invented the term heart healthy to give seed oils? Go ahead.
No, that's right. I mean, so, I remember when I was investigating this story, like coming across this memoir by a former vice president of the American Heart Association, just couldn't believe my luck. I had been I had one of these alerts on my eBay to, like, the moment it came up, I bought it. And now it's just impossible to get a copy of that book. But they actually, so that announcement in 1961 by the American Heart Association, which, by the way, was accompanied also in the same year by Ancel Keys getting himself on the cover of Time magazine as the guy who's cracked the mystery of heart disease. That was the beginning of the medicalization of seed oils. And you might say the medicalization of food. So all of a sudden, seed oils are being marketed as heart healthy. Rip out this page in the magazine and take it to your doctor and buy Mazola. Tell them to, prescribe Mazola oil to you. And it was also the beginning of our decreased consumption of animal foods. But it really represents this shift from, instead of trusting our ancestors or our cookbooks or recipes that have been handed down to us, we started looking to our doctors to tell us what to eat. Instead of your recipe pad, that came from the doctor's prescription pad. So your food was medicalized, and a big part of that was switching over to these seed oils. Which, yeah.
You want to say something about where these things come from? Why did we have them to switch over to?
Well, going back to the hydrogenation story, and Chris, so oil squeezed from a seed. It started. I'll just tell a little bit of the history here. It started in a major way with cotton seeds, which were a byproduct of the cotton crop. And they figured out if they could squeeze them, and they would make cottonseed oil. That was then kind of snuck into butter. There was adulterated butter, and there was ways, but basically, yeah.
Hold on. I want people to understand, as soon as you say that, there is immediately an evolutionary question, because plants make seeds for a reason. When animals open those seeds to get the calorie-rich content, which exists in seeds for plant reasons, in other words, the plant is feeding the seedling by loading calories and nutrients into a seed. The plant has an interest in preventing the animal from accessing those resources, which are obviously otherwise highly desirable. So what does it do? It puts secondary compounds into the seed in order that it isn't worth it to an animal, that the cost of eating the oil in that seed exceeds the benefit, which prevents most creatures who are not in a position to detoxify what's in that seed from engaging in this behavior. So at the point that you say, oh, well, we've got all of these fats that we can learn to squeeze out of seeds, it raises an obvious question that we all should have been asking all along, which is, how safe would it be to eat that stuff, given that the plant has defended it from exactly this behavior?
And in large quantities, right? I mean, even if you were able to consume some of those seeds, such as in sunflower seeds, you wouldn't be expressing the oil just to consume the oil. Right? It's a little bit like, I guess a parallel is fruit juices. Like it's just the seed comes with, it's a whole nutrient package, and you're not just taking out the oil. So, but I want
to the extent that there are secondary compounds in it, the chances that you can detoxify a little are high, but that you can overwhelm the system by taking in so many of those secondary compounds that you're going to cause health impacts is highly likely for a creature that is not specifically adapted to do it.
Right. Well, and that we could just maybe put a pin in that, because plants, beyond just their seeds, contain all kinds of what we call anti-nutrients that inhibit nutrient absorption or cause inflammation or various kinds of, because they're not. Yes, they do that because they can't run away. They
Right. So there is an entire class of molecules that does not serve a function inside of the plant that makes them. The function it serves is to disrupt animal physiology, to dissuade herbivores.
Correct. Right. And they do a very good job of that. Anyway, I don't want to get too far down that, but I want to say, going back to the seed oil story, so the reason oils were first produced from cotton seeds was that there was a desperate need for oil to lubricate the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. This is something that whale oil had been used. In fact, whales were mainly hunted for their oil. And when we hunted all the whales out of the ocean, then replacing that dearth of this commodity was cottonseed, in America at least. And then so that's the kind of the history of how they came into production. And then, as I said, in the early in 1911, Procter and Gamble, who was a soap maker and a tallow maker, because oil is also used to make candles. Fats in general are used to make candles. They looked at this hardened substance and thought, let's try to feed it to as food. I mean, that was really the kind of the essence of the thought process. So I can't remember how we got started down this, but this is, and then what happened, there's the missing piece. So remember that, so oils are fundamentally unstable, as we've described. Because of those double bonds in each of those molecules that we talked about, and the fact that those double bonds at any time can open up and attach themselves not only to hydrogen, which is what happens in hydrogenation, as you explained, but oxygen. So, and especially under conditions of heat and light, they will, like any chemical reaction, they will speed up, they will attach to, double bonds will open up and they will attach to oxygen, and that's called oxidation. So oxidation is not good in many ways. That's one of the reasons we take antioxidants, is to combat oxidation in the body, which drives inflammation. But as a food product, from a manufacturer's perspective, it's also unusable. That's one thing, the oils go rancid. You can't use oil anyway as a shelf-stable, for a shelf-stable food item, because it's greasy, it doesn't hold together. So they had to so with hydrogenation, they figured out how to make it solid. And then they had to figure out something we call partial hydrogenation, which was a little touch of hydrogenation that would allow it to stay as an oil, but not go rancid, not spoil. So, and that
I didn't understand this part of the story. The idea is the more of those double bonds you have, the more vulnerability to going rancid it is, the less suited it is to some long supply chain or sitting on a shelf. So they want to hydrogenate it enough to limit the opportunity of oxygen to bond to that chain without causing it to go solid.
That's right. So hydrogenation is something that exists along a continuum. Fully hydrogenated or almost fully hydrogenated vegetable oil becomes something really hard, like the coating of a chocolate candy hard. If it's a mid-range of hydrogenation, you get something like a cake frosting, or you get something that's softer. Touch hydrogenation allows it to stay as an oil, but be shelf stable on the shelf. And that is how we got Mazola oil, Crisco oil, all of those oils. And they started being marketed to the public in the 1940s, ironically, as perfect for frying things, when we know, even when they're hydrogenated so that they stay stable on the shelf, they're certainly not up to being heated in the kitchen, especially like repeat uses. But it was sold to American housewives, this is what you fry your chicken in. And the reason it can't, it's especially bad to heat those oils is, again, those chemical reactions speed up, and you're talking about more and more oxidation and something called perioxidation products. Anyway, that's a whole subject. I mean, it's really the main reason that we have turned on seed oils in the last, say, 6-7 years, is that they are so easily oxidized, and they yield hundreds of oxidation products.